Hey friends, you're listening to a podcast written by a software engineer. I am Perry Tiu, software engineer, engineering manager, whatever you want to call me really. And on this episode, I get to talk to Maddy Chen. Not only is Maddy a product manager at Visa, she's also a fellow podcaster. Her show is called Tech Gals, where she talks to amazing women in tech and share their stories. If you want to check it out, which I highly recommend, all the links are shared at perrytiu.com/podcast, episode number 33. If you'd like to support this podcast, follow the show and leave a rating on your favorite listening platform like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Even better yet, pick up some merch at perrytiu.com/shop. Anyways, on to the episode. Welcome back to another episode of a podcast written by a software engineer. I'm your host Perry, and today we have Maddy on the show. Maddy, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I keep on saying, but thank you for doing this show, because you are doing so many different things that I've never gotten the chance to touch on, and that's something that I always get the opportunity to learn. But for the people who don't know Maddy too much yet, where are you from and what do you do today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So nowadays I live in San Francisco. I'm a product manager and I am born and raised in the Bay Area, but I went to high school in Taiwan, and so that's where my family is now, and where I would go back if I were to, quote unquote, go home.
And that's the fun part, because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of influence as you grew up of hey, maybe that impacted on your decision to be a product manager at the end of the day. But also the ways product managers think about the same project, because we'll be working on the same project, is so different than all the other individuals contributing to the project. So I cannot wait to get into all the little intricacies of how does the brain of a product manager work and everything. But one thing that I do like to, bring back real quickly, as I was saying, influences in life and passions and hobbies in life kind of thing. I guess your childhood, did you ever get exposed to a lot of technology, I guess? Did you have any siblings that were super into blah, 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 or your parents were super into computers or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like I said, I grew up in the Bay Area, so I was definitely surrounded by a lot of people who were in tech, or they were professors at a university teaching something STEM related. My dad was a computer scientist. He was an engineer. He studied mechanical engineer, so he was really into not only just physical engineering things, but also because day to day he was doing software engineering. He was pretty tech. But my mom, on the other hand, she was into, or her job was accounting and finance. So she was kind of more into the business side of things. I wouldn't say that I had that much pressure. I feel as from a young age to necessarily be in tech. I think my parents were they basically had this mindset of okay, you can do whatever you want. There was never any pressure to go into tech, but they just really wanted me to be financially independent. And so I could, be doing art or theater, and I think my parents would have been okay, that's a little more risky, but they would have let me do it anyways if I could be financially independent. And I think at the end of the day, they just wanted me to be independent, be able to be happy, and, the typical.
Yeah, it's so relatable. Well, from their perspectives that they're independent, I don't have to take care of them. I think that's a lot of that story. But also, to be honest, they are very aspirational and inspirational at the same time, because they do want the good of you no matter what you do at the end. They do want you to be happy. But when if you're just looking for a third person's point of view, which I am at this point, the influence was definitely there. We're talking about mechanical engineering and computer science, especially in the Bay Area, that is very welcoming, because I feel a lot of times people are worried to jump into tech if they don't have the initial influence. If they don't know anybody that did a program or anybody who grew up with technology, sometimes they feel it's a barrier for them to jump into it. I guess at home, did they always did they ever teach you for loops at home? I don't even know if that's a thing, but just how extreme are we talking about?
I definitely didn't learn CS stuff at home. I think my parents never really pushed tech onto me. I just knew that my dad was in tech. Mm-hmm. But funny story, I didn't realize this until I think I was in high school and I was taking AP Econ. My mom studied economics in college, and I remember learning about supply and demand curves, I think when I was I don't know, maybe 10, maybe younger. And it was because I think we were talking about gas prices. My mom was complaining about why gas prices were more expensive recently. And I think I was just why? And then she was let me tell you. And then she started explaining basically supply and demand. And I remember this because when I was officially learning supply and demand in school, my mom, when she talked about it, I was oh, I've learned this before. And I have like this really vivid memory of her teaching me supply and demand, like in the car. It was like in the dark. I was like sitting in the back seat, and I remember being like, this is so hard. Like, why are you teaching this to me? And then as like a high schooler, I was like, okay, that was like probably a nice crash course that I didn't need to know about when I was 10, but like I guess maybe, you know, subconsciously it like seeped through. But I think that definitely shows like how I definitely feel like glad that I feel like definitely having like well-educated parents gave me a little bit of privilege, because I was like, you know, they valued education and they were teaching me these concepts that maybe other people wouldn't have learned from a really young age.
Yeah, definitely talking about being one step ahead already. Like, you were definitely a couple of steps ahead for most kids, so that's the fun part. And
I mean, I don't know if I remembered any of the supply and demand stuff until I actually learned it again, so, you know, we'll see about that.
Funny enough, though, because that's one of the concepts I keep on hearing, that like some people would take like a random class of like whether CS or anything more specific during like elementary school or high school, and then years later they'll come back and like in the back of their mind they'll be like, I've heard of this before, and then it definitely like the relatable one would be like, oh, that's what they were talking about back then. So I think that was it's really interesting to even have that, you know, slight background when we talk about that. This is a complete tangent, but I was having a conversation with somebody else where they were talking about the children of economists, or like the children of like people that have a very, you know, finance or like very eloquent background. It turns out that the kids also end up being very eloquent and like very like
I can see that
speech, you know, very oriented. This is a stupid question. Do you know why? Do you, like, on top of your head, would you have an explanation for that, or is it just like a coincidence that a lot of the kids that are from that have parents that are in that field just end up being, you know, really fun to listen to?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's a coincidence, because I do think that the environment that you grow up in can really affect how you are, like your personality or like the way you speak or, you know, the things you value. And so if your family is just really well spoken, I can totally see how that would rub off on you as a kid, and then you just become really well spoken because that's, you know, the nurture part of your upbringing.
Yeah. Well, the fun part is that my parents don't even bother speaking English or French, so like that's why I sound like an ass most of the time. But
you sound fine.
Thank you. That's the best compliment I'd ever had on this show. One thing I want to touch real quickly is growing up in the Bay Area. Very special experience. People keep on saying this, because I didn't grow up in the Bay Area. I grew up up north in Montreal, Canada. So what I mean by very special experience is that the Bay Area has this, like, you know, status of growing the best engineers, the best tech-focused mind people, the tech, like, you know, even the male people would be talking about, like, here's the latest acquisition, but like this startup. Like, it's a very prominent thing. So maybe from your point of view, as somebody who grew up in the Bay Area, of like elementary school and like middle school, high school, what was like a day-to-day typical like kid that was growing up in the Bay Area?
Yeah, well, I didn't go to high school here. I went to high school in Asia.
Right.
And so I think I escaped a little bit of that, because it definitely becomes, from what I've heard, like more competitive when you hit high school. And so because I didn't spend high school here, I think I didn't quite, you know, have the full Bay Area childhood experience. But I definitely just think that you're just surrounded by a lot of people who their parents work in tech. You've just known about tech. Like, tech has always been there. So I think it's just maybe the influence of like your knowledge or your bubble is surrounded by tech. But I think for some people, like not for me, but I do know other people who've grown up in the Bay Area. Like they've legitimately been coding since they were like 10. And I think maybe because I wasn't that, I did get introduced to my first CS book when I was probably like 13. It was like my dad's old textbook, but I don't think I was interested in it enough to like actually pick up on the concepts and actually like build my own thing when I was like 13. And so I think that's something that may be a little bit different. So for folks who have, you know, the really like they've been learning CS since they were 5 kind of thing, it's because they probably have a really genuine interest in it. And because they were exposed to it so young, they were able to get a head start over other people.
I think I 100% agree with that at the end of the day. I keep on saying that I'm a late bloomer. The first time I ever wrote code is well later than 13, I'll put it that way. But I think this is just the fun part, that a lot of people do end up working in tech with different, you know, journeys, no matter how late you started. Some people have, you know, started coding like well into the 20s and 30s, and they still manage to get into tech at the end.
Yeah.
So, and some people do get the exposure early on, which is why I love hearing everybody's story in terms of like how they got into tech. Sorry, if you didn't realize, this is a really geeky podcast to begin with. before we go into the whole, like, the path to being Maddy today, which is a product manager, and you also do a lot of things on the side, but one thing I do want to mention real quickly is in terms of like hobbies or passions growing up, did you have any, or like were you like a diehard, I don't know, you would play soccer whenever you had the chance to, or like you like painting or anything? Was there anything particular that you like spending your time today or even back then whenever you do have the time to do, not work or not studying?
Yeah, back then I definitely had a wide range of hobbies. I never had, I wouldn't say like throughout childhood, like let's say, kindergarten through 12th grade, I had like one thing that was mostly me. So like in elementary school, I danced, I ice skated, and then in middle school, I started playing basketball, and I actually did paint for a bit, like did art classes, and then I played piano throughout those years, and then in high school, I continued playing basketball, but I didn't really do any of the other things. And I did basketball, I started running long distance, like cross country, and then I was just doing like extracurricular. So there's not one activity that's like a central theme. I guess if you wanted to say anything, I guess you could say I was always fairly active, like some kind of sport in some way, and not just a team sport. It was like individual sports and team sports, but there's no like one activity that trumps it all.
Yeah, you don't have one, you just have 50. No, I'm kidding. That's just, no, the thing is like, the one that stood out the most, like ice skating in California. I didn't realize that was a thing actually. Like,
yeah, there are ice skating rinks.
I do believe it. Not that you say it that way. Like, I do 100% believe it. It's just like, I don't know anybody from California at least who actually like.
Wait, really?
Well, I would know people who are like hockey fans, and they'll be like, "Hey, look, like I'll follow like the Sharks or whatever." Yeah. But like people, I didn't realize there were actual hockey or like ice rinks in California.
One of the ice skaters on the women's team, for the U.S. Olympics women's team, she's from Fremont, California.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Context-wise, Fremont is literally maybe like 40-minute drive from here, barely.
Yeah.
In San Francisco,
it's in the Bay Area.
Yeah. That's so funny. They gotta rep it. Gotta rep those people out there. But even just being exposed to all these different like team sports, as you're saying, or individual sports and all that, like shout out, I'm pretty sure it was your parents that was like bringing you to like all these different events. So like shout out to all the parents who managed to find the time to bring you all that.
Yeah, for sure.
I think at least for me when I grew up, like team sports was always a thing. So I did loads of soccer. I did lacrosse for a good period of time as well, and like our parents were the one that was getting me out there. Funny enough, like did that contribute to like what I do today? Obviously lacrosse and like I do software engineering is like very different, but I think it definitely just helped me in terms of knowing like how to talk to people and like how to manage your expectations when like things go wrong and everything. So at least like I remember back then, like it was definitely well worth it. Extracurricular activities, like all for it, especially as a kid who didn't realize how much of an impact it would have down the road. This is all awesome though. I think if we circle back real quickly to the, I guess, education part, because this is like very fundamental for a lot of people, like of course everybody very fortunate in the at least Western world, crossing fingers that they get to go through the school system. One thing that happens quite often is that at some point you have to make a decision, like take a path and like decide like it's a pretty big decision. Like when you're asking maybe like 16, 17-year-old kids of like, hey, you gotta choose this path that will kind of define the rest of your life. It kind of gets scary. So for your story, I guess, like at what point did you, or like what did you end up choosing at what, I guess, age or like grade? And looking back, how did that turn out, you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think starting when you're really young, a lot of people around you, they'll ask you like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's a pretty common question. And I think I've gone through a lot of different phases of things. Like I said, my parents never really necessarily pushed me to pursue any one path. So I think I had a lot of freedom in that way, though I think it's also because what I ended up choosing was satisfactory to them. And so they didn't have to push me, because, what I picked was like, okay, acceptable to them. But yeah, so like, for example, when I was really young, actually, I remember I have this really clear memory of when I think I was like 5 or 6. It was the Bush election.
Right.
And I remember I was being picked up from like daycare, and I was sitting in the car with another girl who, we were like 6, and I pointed to her sticker, and she had a sticker that said I voted, which is, like when they have kids vote, even though they can't actually vote, it's just for fun. And I was like, oh, like who did you vote for? And she's like, I can't tell you. And I'm like, you can tell me. I won't tell anyone. She told me, forgot who she voted for. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And I was like, oh, I think I might have asked like, oh, like who are the candidates or something like that. And she named the 2 candidates. And I was like, oh, are there any like girls who are the candidates? And she was like, no. And so I remember when I was 6, I was like, and then that night when I went home, I like told my parents that I would like ask them if they voted, and they were like, oh, we voted, or maybe they didn't, don't remember. And then they told me about the candidates. And then I think I was like, oh, like, are there any girl candidates? And they were like, no. And then they were like, you could be the first female president because you are a like naturalized citizen. And my parents are not. My parents are immigrants. And so they're like, we could not be president, but you are because you were born here. And I was like, oh, okay. And so when I was 6, I was like, I want to be the first female president. Well, funny story, like, I don't think I'm going to go into politics, so probably won't happen, but I'm sure an amazing person will be the first female president, and that will be very cool. But like when I was 6, that was the dream. And then I think in middle school, I was really into, like, I was in this like video production class, and I really wanted to be a director, so like a film director or like a director of some kind of like a newscast or something like that. That's what I wanted to be. And then I think somewhere in there when I was taking art lessons, I was like, I want to be like a painter or something. And then I also played piano. I think at some point I was like, I'll be a pianist like full time. And then I think in high school was when I was like, oh, I don't really know what I want to do. I think at first I wanted to study business because that's kind of like the default. Like if you're not going to be an engineer, I feel like the default is like you're going to go into business. And then when I got to college, I was still undecided. And eventually I kind of stumbled upon data science, and then I tacked on econ. And so I was a data science econ major, and that's kind of what I ended up with when I graduated from college.
Yeah, what a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
I think people keep on saying it that way. I like how you say the default is like econ or like business at that point, because I think where I'm from, the default was psychology. I think that was
really?
the one.
Well, it has to be something or something else, right? Like,
yeah.
So what was the other option if not psychology? Like, what
I think most people that like go into university, like the first one you hear is like obviously business major. Like that was 100% the easy way to understand it. But like for us, when I grew up, it was a lot of health sciences. A lot of people would go into biology. I started off my first semester in university, physiology and math, which is a weird combination, but I did lots of health sciences. But obviously I swapped into computer science and software engineering. So, I mean, I'm telling you, that worked out perfectly fine. But it's funny that the default over there, if you weren't doing, health sciences or that, you would just swap to psychology or something like that and it would just work out. But it's actually really powerful with all the, all the way that you got exposed. Like, you're going to be the first female president. Like, if any kid hears that, they honestly at some point will believe it, which is like the crazy part. Because like if you tell that to 100 kids, one of them is going to become the first female president at that point. So whether it was a white lie or not, I don't know. But I think people should definitely say that more often at the end. Yeah. One of the things that is actually, I guess, relatable for most people is that like they do want to delay the decision as long as possible. For me, if I have to relate on like when I had to make the call, I always chose health sciences because that was like, I was saying like the default. Always do health sciences until proven otherwise, basically. And the moment for me proven otherwise was like university. I was like, I don't like health sciences. I'm going to go into computer science and we're going to do that. For, I guess, like just timeline's sake at this point, like, did you even have a choice in high school? Because I know like a lot of people in the States or even like in Asia, like they start picking either classes or like a path. For me, it was like in grade, I think, 10, which is around maybe 15, 16, where they're like, you go into history or you go into, sciences. That was when like, it was a pretty big decision at that time. So you had to choose one or the other. Did you have something similar where it was like 50-50, like down this road or down that road?
Yeah, a little bit. So basically so we were on the AP system and we didn't offer the full suite of APs. There was like a limited number, which also meant that like, if you were going to go take any APs, like you kind of just take like whatever's offered. And so like in 10th grade, you can only take like AP Bio. So like I took AP Bio. And then I think junior and senior year is when there was like a slight divide. So you could take like macro econ or you could take AP Chem. And I took macro econ because I was like, oh, I don't really like chemistry that much. And then like senior year, it was like you can take like micro econs, AP Stats, or you can take AP Physics. And I guess small nuance was like they split, there were 2 AP Physics. So I had taken one of the AP Physics already. So like senior year, I didn't take like the more advanced AP Physics. So I guess it was a little bit split that way, but like,
yeah,
I probably could have still gone into like STEM like once I got to university if I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I kind of did, but I also didn't go down like hard engineering.
What's the most impressive of all this? That like you still remember to that level of details, like when those happen. A lot of people like I remember asking to a lot of people, they're like, I just ended up they would just say something like you have no idea what you're talking about. But like the fact that you actually do remember those like tiny little details, like that is actually really impressive because that did end up leading you to something that is actually quite interesting in terms of like majors. So with all of those decisions at the end, with all the AP classes and everything, you ended up, as you were saying, you did a major in data science and econ, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
That is fascinating because I don't think data science was even a program that was offered where I went to university.
It's pretty new, yeah.
I'm all about to go into that, but for just like context wise, which university did you go to?
I went to UC Berkeley.
I thought you were going to say go Bears right after that. But
Go Bears.
Yeah, I didn't go to Berkeley. I just know people that go to Berkeley that do say go Bears all the time. But so UC California, University of California, Berkeley is one of those, I guess, part of the family of the University of California. Mm-hmm. If you don't mind me, I'm going to dive like super into the data science because like for me, like I'm trying to grasp of what do you teach in data science? You know what I mean? Like how do you start? And that's what I guess university is kind of good for, is that like they know how to break down where to start, what's the minimal thing. So my biggest question is that like how much of that required you to know, I guess, either any bit of coding or any bit of like linear, or like where did this whole like data science start to begin with?
Yeah, so the data science major at Berkeley is fairly new. I think I am like the third graduating class or something like that. And so it is very, very new. It like literally started when I was in college. So like when I applied to college, it was not an option. And then it became an option when I was in college. So it is fairly new in terms of like what kinds of things you learn. I think the data science major is fairly flexible because of there are many applications that you can go into with data science. And so in terms of like the basic classes, there's a basic like data science class, which is just like Python. It's like really basic Python stuff like for loops and if-else statements, and like basic stats. And then you take like the basic intro stat and CS classes. And then there's a more advanced data science class. And then when you go into like more upper division classes, it's like the advanced data science class, you have to take a machine learning class, you have to take a probability class, you have to take linear algebra. And then from there, you got to pick a like concentration. And so your concentration can just be like, there's like actually so many concentrations you can pick. So it can be a bio concentration. It can be a like electrical engineering concentration. I personally picked the psychology concentration because that was something I was interested in. And then there's also an ethics class. And I think the ethics class is something that for most people, it was something that was like, I just have to take this and I don't really want to take it kind of class. But I think that like as I've entered like working and just seeing like more news and more things happen about like, like data breaches or security issues, I think I'm starting to realize that, the professors at Berkeley knew what they were talking about and they knew what they were doing when they were making us take that ethics class that no one actually wanted to take, but they knew it would be good for us because I think they were really trying to train us or at least have us start thinking about the fact that like us working with data had a lot of different like implications to it and they want us to make like smart decisions. Like they are educating us because they want us to be like ethical data scientists. And so I think that is actually something that's unique but really smart that they added that course in.
Yeah, because everything that you said so far is like, it's borderline like new to me. Like I know what data science is. I know what's the difference between a data engineer versus a data science. I know the difference between an ML engineer versus ML science. But like in terms of like how they shape the students and the whole thing, this is absolutely fascinating in terms of like, I never knew that like with the concentration and with, of course, I just assumed that you had to take some CS classes no matter what.
Yeah, you do.
Doing the whole thing. But even taking ML classes, I don't even think that was an offering back when I did university back then. So that was another fascinating point. Maybe I'll just geek out for a second. We will touch a bit maybe on the business side of your like other econ. But this is the part where I find it absolutely fascinating is that like it does make sense with data science, at least like language of choice is Python at the end. One thing that we could geek out about is it just I guess, vanilla Python, or do they leverage like any packages that, or any tools like Jupyter or any kind of stuff that helps you?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure like it was like Berkeley professors who created Jupyter. So we do use Jupyter notebooks. That's where most of the like class assignments are on. You do learn Python packages. You don't actually just learn Python. So for example, a lot of the stat classes are in R, so you have to learn R, and then most data science classes are taught in Python, and then the data structures class is in Java. And then with one of the intro classes of CS, I think you use Scheme as well, which is like kind of useless, but
whoa!
I guess
I'm kidding.
I mean, I have never met someone who uses Scheme in their like day-to-day work life, so I don't really know why they teach it, but it's probably just for like building, logical muscles or something like that.
Oh yeah, people use Scheme for just the fundamental and like academia purposes behind it.
Yeah, no one actually uses it like in work.
I think it was definitely geared towards like academia and like for further, like if you're doing your master's degree and all that, like it's very good at explaining some concept. I don't know if they ever did that demo of like using Scheme to, do factorials really efficiently, or they would do like some, like it's very performant for very specific cases. And that's the only reason why I remember them talking about it, because it kind of just blew our mind at that point. But I think everything that you've said so far, I love that you mentioned R, because R was, I don't know if it's going to offend anybody, but R was the gold standard of data.
Yeah.
Anything related, like data warehouses, like anything, like R was the go-to. Yeah. But nowadays, like Python took over. Julia is another big one. Did they ever like touch a bit on that while you were out there?
No. They did touch upon SQL. I did forget about that one. Yeah, we did learn a little bit of SQL.
That's something important. Funny enough though, like those are, I think, as you're saying, like I don't find it as like mesmerizing in terms of like data science. Like a lot of these are just super relatable as you talk about. Like when we talk about Java, of course, everybody in academia at least do a bit of Java at that point. I don't know if it's true, but apparently Oracle just pays university to force it to teach Java. But somebody could be wrong. Maybe. I believe it. But one of the cool thing about all of this is that like how much of this program, this like data sciencey program, is geared towards going into academia. I only ask this because when I clearly remember when I was in my computer science degree with like the emphasis on like the software engineering side, a lot of the classes are definitely geared towards expecting you to go into a graduate degree, like a graduate program, whether your specialty is going to be in machine learning or like software validation or any other stuff. Did you feel that there was that intent behind, I guess, this program when you were taking it, or was it the intention that you do this program and then you'd be doing this professionally at like different jobs, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I can't say for sure, but I feel like the number of people who go into academia is just like statistically lower than the number of people who go into corporate life. And so I think it's fair to assume that they would assume that most people were going into industry.
That's totally fair. And even for my own historical assessment, like, yeah, the entry rate from undergrad to grad was like so tiny that most of the people that I know didn't end up doing grad school at that point. One thing that I do know that shapes a lot of people during their studies at the same time is internships. I'll speak for myself. I unfortunately didn't do any internships. I spent my summers working at summer day camps, looking over kids, but at the same time I got to build a lot of fun stuff on my side. So that's kind of how I shaped up during my university life. But how about you though? Were you very encouraged to do internships, or like how did that work with the program that you were in?
Well, I think one thing to remember is Berkeley's a massive public school, and so I don't actually think that they play any role in I don't want to say helping, but I don't think they play a big role in, let's say, forcing students or encouraging students to go do anything with their summer. And so definitely my choice to pursue internships was like a self-motivated choice, or talking to alumni and them saying like, oh, it's a good idea. That's a good way to spend your summer. Yeah.
So I'm just going to assume that you did at least multiple internships during your time, or how did that look like?
I did do multiple internships.
All right. I mean, I don't want to sit here for 5 hours. I'm kidding. Let's talk about a couple of those, because like that's something super relatable, because I know a lot of people who are in this path of like they are currently in the storm of their studies and maybe they want to get into that. So let's talk about maybe the first internship you got into. Like, what was it? How did you get into it? And what was that all about?
Yeah, so my first internship was at a machine learning startup. This was before I decided to go into data science. I was actually taking the first intro data science class, and interning at this ML startup. That was my first internship. I found it by cold emailing a bunch of companies off of AngelList because I was a freshman in college, and I was like, I have no experience, no one's gonna hire me, but I will shoot my shot anyways. So I cold emailed a bunch of people, and then I think I heard back from a couple of companies, and so I did a couple of rounds of interviews then.
Like, asterisk, like, cold emails work. Like, it's crazy to think about it, but it works as long as you have a very, I guess, like, concise goal. I don't know if that's what you were expecting in terms of, like, actually getting an internship out of cold emailing, but, like, as far as I could tell, it definitely worked out well in your favor at that point. So,
I mean, it worked out for me. I don't know if that's a solid plan. I don't know if I would recommend people cold emailing. I think it was also different because I think I knew that I was cold emailing like startups who don't have as much bandwidth or like monetary resources to hire, let's say, someone who's like full-time. And so they could take on someone who like costs less temporarily. Like if they seem okay, then like, it's like lower risk. And just startups, they just don't have as much interest. And so that's kind of the route I went with. I don't know if I like expected to get anything out of it. I mean, I still tried hard to get something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess it worked out for me.
It's better than nothing. As far as the end of the day, the fact that you have this will and drive to do stuff like that is always better than doing nothing at that point. So I think that's the basis, at least I compare myself to. Funny enough, though, like, it's so funny how all the story, like, sure, it's very tech and STEM oriented, and like they don't have a degree in how to become a product manager, or like they don't have a degree in become product management. Mm-hmm. So let's bridge that gap. But maybe like in terms of other internships though, you did this ML startup, and I'm assuming that during that internship you were doing a lot of creating data models to actually like feed in some educated guess or like prediction in terms of what
I was not. I was absolutely not.
Terrible guess for me then.
I mean, I was a freshman. I was taking my first data science class. So I was like learning to code for the first time.
Right.
So I was absolutely not running machine learning models. I was doing like marketing for the company. And so it was interesting though. I was like basically the head of marketing at the startup for 3 months. So that's kind of what I did there. And then the following summer, I did like a software engineering internship. The summer after that, I was supposed to do a data science internship at a larger company, but it got canceled because of COVID. Right. And so then I ended up doing like data science research for a startup again, and then I graduated, and now I'm working full time.
Okay, even before I jump into the fact that how does having this exposure to like being a software engineer for a little bit, how does that influence being a product manager at the end? Like, I definitely know there's an impact because the best product managers I've worked out there have some sort of at least like experience or background as being, more closer to software engineering world. So real quickly, in terms of like software engineering internships, like I know a lot of people like find that as like so valuable. Like you have to do software engineering internship if you want to get to software. What was your experience like? How did that shape you in terms of like, what did you do during your software engineering internship? Is that what you were expecting? Did you code like day to day, day out? Did you do daily stand-ups? Did you do all that kind of stuff? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, I think my internship ended up being kind of untraditional / like not what I expected. I think I wasn't really given a solid project by my manager. And then I think that after that, I just, most of the time I found myself having a lot of time on my hands. And so I was just playing a lot of ping pong, and I was like, okay, this is not really how I want to spend my summer and my time, even though playing ping pong was pretty fun. And so I actually went out and like self-sourced a project. And the project I found myself was actually a little bit more like data science oriented than it was software engineering. But from the exposure that I did get from software engineering and then just taking more advanced CS courses around the same time, I think it helped me realize that I wasn't that interested in going down the software engineering route.
Yeah, and I think like you do need that confirmation at some point. Like some people will always be speculative with a bit like, am I gonna like this? Am I like? And some people never get to answer that question. And I feel absolutely terrible.
For sure.
Like if that happens. But I'm really glad that at least you got to experience a bit of that. And then if we even go on to the story of like product management, what is product management? How did that go? Because that's something that you, I guess, live and breathe today, which is always super fun. But yeah, let's definitely jump into that because obviously congratulations on graduating your program. That's obviously like the hardest part for anybody. But yeah, tell us about like product management. What veered you toward it? Like, there was a point where you're like, yes, I know I'm not super fascinated or like super going into the software engineering route, which a lot of people end up going down that route just because I think a lot of that is default in the Bay Area. But real briefly, at that point, when you graduated, I guess like, how did you get your first product management role, considering your background was super heavy in like the data science and the software engineering world?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so so that was my sophomore year, and then my junior year of college, I was pursuing more data science heavy things.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically when I was entering my senior year, I was like, okay, I could either go down the data science route, or I could try this thing called product management that I don't actually know anything about. But it sounds cool. And I've had people tell me that I could be like a good fit for a PM since I was like a freshman, and I just didn't listen to them. And so what happened was, I think I learned a little bit more about PM. Around that time, I also started my own podcast, and I was basically treating my podcast like a product. And so I was iterating on it like a product. I was collecting metrics and feedback. I basically set my own like mini OKRs for it. I was creating my own content, so it was that in that way you could say I was like developing it myself, but I was really treating this podcast like a product, and I really enjoyed that process a lot. And so that was my, I would say like testing grounds, or my mini internship, you could say, into product management. And that's something that I really talked about, I think, in a lot of my interviews when I was interviewing for product management roles, because with the limited number of new grad PM roles, there has to be something that you talk about. And if you don't have previous product experience, it's really hard to answer the question, why are you interested in product management, when you don't have a product management internship or experience. And so I really leaned on my podcast to explain how I treated it like a product. And that's how I confirmed that I would be interested in pursuing product full time.
Yeah, we are definitely going to dive into your podcast and everything in just a second. But everything that you've mentioned so far, like, not to downplay any of it, but even just bringing all the words of like OKRs and learning about the process of like the testing or like the user research of that, I've learned that well late into like actually being in the industry and like being exposed to all the product manager at that point. And even you being able to be like self-sufficient in that moment of being like, this is what I need to learn. Maybe for the people that are listening, like, what kind of resources did you go out there? Because you was mentioning about like, I'm learning about PM. I don't assume that like at school they will have like a class of like learning how to PM, if you know what I mean. So what does that mean in terms of like learning about PM? Like, what were actual like steps that you did? Googling, or how did that look?
Yeah. So I think I talked to a couple of people who are in the product space, or people who had worked with product managers. And then, the rest of it was really just like Googling, reading blogs, reading other sites, watching probably YouTube videos. And then at some point I had bought some of the most basic like PM books to practice like PM casing. And then also just to read up on like what the interview is like, and then what the job might be like and what to expect.
That is absolutely fascinating, just because I keep on seeing this. I would repeat what you said, but like with the software engineering world, like back then it's like, go online, Google everything that you want to know about specific topics. Like if it's a framework that you really like using, then do that. If there's interview stages related to that kind of interview process for software engineering, like do that. So it's so funny that like nowadays, product management is so crucial. I keep on saying it, like people disrespect sometimes the whole product management role, but the thing is like, you need to have at least some sort of like overseeing product management, or else the project goes to complete doo-doo if it doesn't happen. So the path that you've taken there in terms of like being a product manager, it reflects everything that we've talked about so far. Willingness to go out of your way to actually like figure out how stuff works, and you definitely know the benefit of if you do invest a bit more time doing that. I guess like, I didn't even want to ask these questions, but like, when did you get exposed to the term OKR? Because this is a very Bay Area term, and I don't know if like anybody else like. Well, Bay Area term. A lot of companies use it across the world nowadays.
The tech company term.
Yeah, like how did that even come up? Because like I know what OKR stands for, objective key results, and the thing is, key results is a single word with a dash in the middle of it. So like it's objective and 2 words. But did you learn that like on your own kind of thing, or like were you exposed by somebody else? Like I just want to have a little like tangent on what is OKRs real quickly.
Yeah. I think I learned about it reading, specifically that phrase. I learned about it probably reading through like blogs and whatnot. But I had been exposed to a really similar concept of just like objectives, and then also like metrics and like vision setting through a nonprofit that I worked with since I was in high school. And so that's kind of where I learned the general concept.
This nonprofit, though, I feel like it did play a major part in who you are and what you do today. You want to just give a brief overview of what that was about and if you still do it today, or what was the impact of that when you were doing it?
Yeah, so this nonprofit is called the Global Leadership Organization. I've been involved since I was in high school. Like, it's been a good, like, maybe 8 years now, maybe 7. But I haven't always been super actively involved. I was really active for maybe like 5 or 6 years. And then I kind of stepped back to take a break and kind of let other people run the thing. And I think it gave me a lot of insight and direction into how to organize meetings, how to delegate, and then just kind of think more industry-like, or just give me a framework for thinking about problems at a really young age. And I think that exposure was really good for me. I think also it gave me a community of like-minded people who were fairly ambitious, who had big dreams, or even just kind of thought about those kinds of things. I think is really different, because not everyone thinks about the future, will be really introspective, but I think this community of people really pushed me to like really bring out that side of me, which I think was always there, but having people who are like that, I think can really help you like, you know, bring that out and be able to embrace it and talk about it and have people to be around.
That's absolutely awesome. In terms of like, I mean, we're not going to spend the rest of the episode diving into that, but I wasn't sure if you have any links, like let me know. We're more than happy to link those through, because like it definitely seems like a positive impact on you, but also just the world in general. So Global Leadership Organization, if I'm mistaken, that's what it's called. And big shout out to them. One thing that I will not hold back right now is the product management world. I've, over the years of being a software engineer, I've definitely been exposed to many product managers, product owners. This is something that I totally respect at the end of the day, because I don't know what my life would be without that, I guess, counterpart. I don't even know if that's the right word to put it, but for the people less familiar, I guess, like, what is product management? Like, why is that even a role to begin with? Maybe you could probably help us out of like, what is product management basically?
Yeah, I think the best way to explain it would be, if you think about the engineers as the people who build the product managers are the ones to define what you're building and why you're building, and to bridge that gap between like the business priorities and then building the actual feature or the actual like product.
That definitely helps, because a lot of times, like, if you don't tell why we're building this, engineers will build blindly. They will just go in a direction and it will just keep on going and going and going with that. Like, I totally agree with that. I'm an engineer. I've done that a million times. And the question of like why we need to build it.
I also think the question why helps to kind of, it helps the engineers, or just the team in general. I don't want to say just the engineers, but help the team understand like why this is important. And it helps with like, you know, motivation and just the bigger picture, so that they don't just feel like they are building things for the sake of building things or being told what to do when they don't know what the purpose is. Yeah,
and that's great. Even like, this is definitely a good start to like what is product management. Like, it is crucial in terms of like making sure that the direction of a project being built is going to the right direction and meets acceptance criteria that are defined in some way. It meets goals that are being set all across the company. But if we talk about the individual in terms of like a product manager, so if we just describe a typical day for Maddy at the moment in terms of like in the product management space, like what would that look like? Just to have a bit more context. Like, do you sit on a team? Do you work alone? Like, how does somebody who, you know, practices product management live day to day? Yeah, I do want to preface with, I've only been a PM for like 8 months, maybe less. So I don't want to say that I know everything about product management. This is just from my 8 months of experience, what I can say so far. 8 months more than me, so that's fine. I would say my day-to-day has been, well, right now I'm working on a project that is very user interview heavy. And so I've been sitting in on a lot of user interviews, a lot of strategy, a lot of design reviews, and then maybe like prepping for the next round of user interviews. That's kind of what a lot of my projects have been like nowadays, a lot of the tasks I've been doing. In a different project that I worked on, some of the tasks I had to do was writing requirements. It was like answering questions with the engineers, letting them know what they would be building, and then also like once they finish building, make sure that everything met like QA and acceptance criteria, like you mentioned before,
and then I help to walk one of the particular features through launch.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people underestimate the, I guess, proportions. Real quickly, in terms of team composition there, how many product managers for how many engineers? I feel like it is not realistic to have one product manager per engineer. So imagine a team of like 4 engineers, you're not going to have four product managers. Yeah. So I guess like from your exposure, or for the people who are unfamiliar with how product managers sit in a team, like what does this like ratio kind of look like?
Yeah, I think the general rule of thumb, people say it's like 1 to 20, but I think because my team currently is, or the company is fairly large, I think it's maybe more like 1 to 10.
Mm-hmm. And I think like from experience, I think that's pretty accurate in terms of how PM sits. Sometimes like PMs will be floating, as we call it, like jumping between teams, and that happen quite often depending on the feature, the project that's being built at that point.
Yeah, or the company. I think some companies like 1 to 50.
Yeah, that's a little bit outrageous. If you ask me.
Okay, maybe like 1 to 40, but it's like 1 to like a lot of people.
Yeah, which is unrealistic, and obviously I think it's probably within the the whole staffing world of like the talent world. Like, of course, maybe it's because there might be a lack of PMs at that point, but yeah, I definitely do get the struggle on that point. But given this world of product management, if we get a little bit more into details of like, fascinated with all the day-to-day stuff is like helping engineers like figuring out why this feature is being built, or like. One thing that I've always been, the way I communicate with product managers, of course, I talk to them. I love them to death. But also another way that gets communicated is that usually a board system, whether like a ticketing system and all that. If we go into that real quickly of like, if it's somebody working in a team with product managers and engineers, what is the standard nowadays, I guess, of working with software or building any project? So from my experience, I've been exposed to a lot of like Jiras. I've been exposed to a lot of like Notion. I've been exposed to a lot of like other different frameworks like Asana as well that just have a tracking system. I guess what is your take on that in terms of like, do you like doing that? Because that's for the people who are unfamiliar with like Jira, for example. It's like a ticketing system where if there are business requirements coming in or new features being built in, they're broken down into tickets, and those tickets gets assigned to people that do write the code at the end. And then within that ticket, you would have like acceptance criteria, you would have resources. If there are designs, you would slap it on that. You would like, if there's any testing phases, you would add it onto that. So I feel like that's how I see at least how that's useful for a team. So I guess on your take in terms of like, how do you communicate with engineers and what other tools do you do to make it so that it's efficient basically?
Yeah, I've only been exposed to one of those tools, Jira. And so I can't really speak on behalf of anything else. But if I may, I'm really curious if I can ask you a question. You said that it seems like you have a really positive experience with PMs. And I feel like that's not the case with a lot of my friends who are either designers or software engineers. I feel like a good amount of my friends don't like the PMs that they work with. And so I'm curious, how come you love your PMs so much? Have you just always had really good PMs, or you just have a lot of respect for their role? Or how come seems like you have a really positive impression of PMs?
Oh yeah, the answer is like, hell no. I've had terrible PMs. I'm kidding. It's just that like, I know what they go through. I know what PMs go through is that like, sometimes they just don't have the answer. And like saying they don't have the answer doesn't solve any problem. So that's number one. But the other bit is that like, when I keep on saying that the best PMs I've ever worked with, it's because they've been on the other side of like a software engineer that have to push out code all the time. And their blockers for a lot of like software engineers, for example, is that it's not spec'd right, or like there's not enough information on the ticket, or like those are like stuff that you will hear, and that's when they get a little bit aggy about it. So on my end, why I respect so much product managers, that like, first of all, the ratio, like you have 1 PM for like 10 people or like 7 people, whatever it is. It's not easy at the end of the day, and it's more like a team effort of like making sure if something is not spec'd out, make it a team responsibility. It shouldn't be like a single individual why like the acceptance criteria is not there. Of course, like some people have more say in terms of like writing the ticket and putting exactly this feature needs to meet these acceptance criteria. But on the other hand, is that like it's nearly impossible to do the job perfectly. So maybe my standard is lower, maybe that's how you would call it. But I'm not shy of saying if something's missing on a ticket, I will mention it to the PM, and I will know that it's not going to be done immediately, but they have their shit together and they know when to tackle this when it needs to. So for me, when I talk to PMs, like I'm very like checklist, direct, point to point, be like, this is what's missing. I don't have the SVG for this, basically. I could directly ask the designer for sure, but I think like having a consensus that like, at least the biggest problem is tickets get started without enough without enough details to start the ticket. And that's usually where most engineers, at least us, we start complaining is that we are working on something and we're blocked. So that's like the biggest friction point. But the reason why I keep on saying that, like, I respect everything product managers do is that, like, they don't have it easy. As in, like, I'll say this a million times. Over the years of working on software engineering, if I became a product manager, I will 100% like see it from the other end and understand why it's so hard. And I will do my best of like making sure that by the time somebody starts something, it's ready to go. But realistically, there's stuff that's going to fall through, and it's on the software engineer to also be accepting that it happens.
Yeah.
You can't just point fingers and be like, that's all the PM's fault and everything, because it doesn't work that way. So I don't know if that answered your question.
It's very empathetic of you.
Yeah. To be fair though, like I keep on saying, I care about the people more about the product. No, that's not true. That's not true. Whoever's listening to this, I do think that like it starts with the people, and then if the people is taken care of, then the product will follow at that point. But sorry, big spiel on why I respect product management. But if we talk real quickly in terms of like product development cycle, maybe that's another one. Before we jump into all your podcasts, because I do want to talk about that, because I know there's so many stuff that I will learn from you talking about it. I guess for the people that are familiar with the software development cycle, it's pretty straightforward. You receive a ticket, you build it, code review, QA process, release it, and then there's a loop, which is why we call it a cycle, that feedbacks, you come back in, and then that comes back to the whole loop. But then the kind of like the mysterious area for some people, or at least for engineers, like the step before receiving the ticket. That's usually where very heavy with the product involvement, designer involvement. From your experience so far, how would you describe that? Like the product development cycle, or you know, any kind of more insight how that looks like?
Well, I feel like I'm being interviewed. Yeah. Okay. So again, I've only had so many months of experience, so I don't want to say I know everything. But from the limited experience that I do have, I think it has been a conversation between me or like my manager and other product owners. Like, what is it that we want to build? Why this is important? And then like exactly like what the requirements are. And then at least in my experience, I've worked with our technical engineering manager to write out the spec or write out the requirements. And so I think in my latest project, one of the latest projects that I worked on, it was a contractual agreement for the features that we were building. And so in that case, it was pretty straightforward. Like when I showed up, there was already a list of features that was like, we need to finish building this by Q2. Go like write the requirements for it. And so that was pretty straightforward. But from what I understand, in most cases, it is sometimes a game of having to prioritize with other stakeholders what features need to be built or which features are more important. And then you can take whatever you've decided is more important to go write the requirements for that. And I think the higher up you get and like the more important you get, you know, the higher you climb the corporate ladder, you get more say over like which ones to prioritize. You get a bigger scope of products that you're responsible for and the direction that you get to help lead for those products. So I think it also depends on, right now I'm fairly entry level, and so I don't have as much say in terms of like what we're building or what we're doing, but the higher you go, the greater the scope and the greater the impact you could make.
Yeah, and I think that's objectively reasonable that like obviously the higher you go is you have more say because you have more judgment at that point. That's probably like very tied with why some decisions are made, because at the end of the day when we talk about accountability, like there's obviously so many factors on that that could be its own episode at that time. But thanks for sharing with the world of product management, because I know a lot of people like you don't really study for it and a lot of people don't know how to get into it, but even just hearing your story of how you got into product management and like what you get to do day to day, I think a lot of people find that more than inspirational to actually be like, oh, look, that's definitely a path for a lot of people. And like the impact, I keep on saying it, like the impact of product management is 100% there. And products do not get delivered without product management. Some people will fight me for that, but...
Yeah, I do want to say that I think nowadays product management is a really hot role that a lot of people kind of aspire for. And I think I was talking to a very seasoned product manager, and I was asking her like, what is something that you would say is a like maybe a con of product management, or like something people don't realize when they say they want to do it, and then maybe they do it and then they realize that this is not for them. I think one really big thing is that when things go well as a PM, it's never your win. It is always other people's win. And when things go poorly, it is always your fault. And so in some ways you could argue that it's really hard to celebrate your success because it never feels like just your success. But when things go wrong, it is always only your fault. And so I think that's something that is people could be mindful of. And then another thing is, I think the feedback loop in terms of like what you're doing right is a lot slower, right? Like as an engineer, if you're building something, if you're doing front end, you can directly see what you're building and like how it's different. Even for back end, you can test it to see, does it work? Does it not work? And if it works, it feels really good. It's almost like it's instant gratification knowing that like you solved something and you did something with your time. But for PM, the cycle is so much longer that gratification could take like 3 to 6 to like 1 year to get. Mm-hmm. And so the feedback loop is just so much longer. And some people don't like that. They're not okay with not knowing that at the end of the day that they've, done something useful with their time. And so it also kind of depends maybe on your working style or your preferences.
I do relate to a lot of those points, especially in terms of like, but then again, you have engineers who fix a downtime. They're like, I'm so glad it's taken care of just because like the site is not down anymore. I think there's just that bit of like, it's not an improvement, it's just a maintainability thing. Mm-hmm. But also like the other bit that like I hear a lot of engineers say is that like, most of the time when something gets released, like it is definitely through product managers through it. So like they definitely do get the first line of highlights. So that's maybe the compromise on that. But like it's a topic that people love talking about. At the end of the day, personally, I think that's just all politics. So
maybe
a lot of times like it is important no matter what. Look at any organization is important. But at least my take on it is that like I've lived through enough of these that like I don't really mind this gratification instantly or not. I think like in the long run, you know what you like, and then it just adjusts your expectation to what actually happens when you join a team like that. So, absolutely fascinating on the product management side. One thing I do want to make sure I definitely tackle is the podcast life, the life of what is this project going on, because it definitely had a very positive impact in terms of who you are today, what you're able to accomplish today. So, first of all, let us know, what is your podcast?
Yes, my podcast is called Tech Gals. I have not released a new episode in a few months now, but it was really fun while I was doing it. I really enjoyed it, definitely learned a lot, got to meet a lot of cool people. Some of the things I just talked about PM was actually from some of my podcast episodes. And so, yeah, it was just kind of a fun side project that I started during the pandemic.
Yeah. And real quickly, in terms of like the content of the podcast, like what exactly was the goal, or what kind of some of the contents that you covered in your podcast?
Yeah, so the vision of the podcast was to be able to help motivate and inspire other women or minorities that were pursuing tech or interested in tech, either currently or aspiring to be in tech, just to be able to hear from other like role models of people who have been through the experience, just because tech is obviously such a male-dominated profession or industry that it can be really helpful sometimes to hear or see someone who looks like you or sounds like you, their experiences and things that they're going through, to know that like, oh, hey, like I'm not alone in this. Someone feels for me. They have very similar, they have very similar struggles. And so that's kind of where the podcast was born and like the goal and the vision of it.
Yeah. And I think like that definitely answers the question of like how it came to be. Because a lot of times like I do get this question like, why do you start a podcast?
Yeah.
And like obviously very less like righteous compared to what you were saying over there. So at least like on my end is like I get to talk to very interesting people. So I do like when you were being able to articulate it that way. It definitely helps with a lot of people who are maybe afraid of starting this. Like there is a good intent for a lot of people putting stuff like that. But on the more like I guess like geeking out side, this is for me because a lot of people that do want to start a podcast, they don't know where to start. Like what do I do? Like what equipment do I need kind of thing. So like now that we covered a little bit like your podcast in terms of like what is it, if I don't mind asking, like physically or like action wise, like how did you start a podcast? Like is there a software that you help? Is there stuff that you need to buy? Like if I start with nothing, what was your journey like in terms of making this an actual thing?
Yeah, you can definitely start with nothing in terms of equipment. I mean, you can just talk into your phone or your Apple microphone if you want to. My first thing that I bought was a really cheap microphone, like an extremely cheap microphone. And I was just kind of unsatisfied with the level of quality that it was because you could still hear static noises in the background. So I ended up upgrading to a slightly nicer microphone, but it was still like basically the cheapest nice microphone that you could get. And so that's still the microphone that I use today. So in terms of equipment, that's what I bought. I edit on GarageBand because I have a MacBook and I've used GarageBand before, but a lot of people I know, they use Audacity. But that required me learning a whole new software. But let's say, if you have a Windows machine, you can download Audacity and it's free. And so that's something that you can use. And then, yeah, in terms of like things to do, it was definitely more work than I thought it would be. Like I thought it would just be like record an episode, edit, upload, but turns out you need a bunch of things like an RSS feed. I personally use Anchor, which is it's owned by Spotify now, but you basically can upload podcasts for free and they help distribute it to all different platforms for you. And so that's really nice and convenient. So that's what I use in terms of hosting. But then other small things that I had to do were, for example, like the first iteration of my podcast, I built a website for it, just to have, general information about it, link all my episodes on it. I made the cover art for it, which was like really basic. And then, you have to write like a description for it, and stuff like that. So those were little things I didn't think I needed to do, but I did. I ended up also making like an Instagram account for it, a Facebook account for it, so that I could post about new episodes and post like, stories for it. But those are kind of unnecessary things from a really basic level. You just need, let's say, like a cover art, you need like audio, you need like something to say, and you need a topic, and then you just need to upload that. So from a really basic level, it's not that hard to get started, but I think the hard part is depending on your goals. If you want to grow the podcast, it's a lot harder than it is. I think it takes some effort if you really want to grow it and like make it really monetizable and like make a lot of money off of it. That's really not that easy.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on the whole rabbit hole of like the podcast, bro. Like,
yeah.
Even doing the graphic design bit, I just spent too many hours on freaking GIMP. That's what it was. I was using GIMP to like get the perfect like background on the whole thing. Like, it is the good thing is that like you learn every time you do something like this. Like every step that you take in terms of like getting this uploaded or getting that cleaned up, that post-production cleanup, like you always learn something from doing that at that point. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. But something that I feel like maybe it's more relatable to like people that create content and everything is, where do you find ideas for content? Like, I know it's a very general, it's very subjective at the end of it because everybody has their own method. But like for me, in terms of like, for me, my content is very straightforward. I meet cool people and I ask them to be on the show and they're willing to do it, and I get an absolute blast out of the whole thing. But maybe you have a different process. What would your, I guess, where to find content / content creation process look like?
Yeah. So for most of my content, it's also interview based. So I also am interviewing other people, so I do not have to come up with the cool storyline and the cool answers for everything. I do have a couple of episodes where I do like Q&As or talk about a specific topic. And I think in the very beginning, it was extremely awkward. Like I absolutely do not know how to just like talk to myself for like 30, 40 minutes. But I think over time it became slightly easier as you get used to it. So yeah, that's kind of what I did. And I generally had things I like wanted to talk about, and that's why I did like an individual episode about it. So for example, the first time I did it, like my first episode was just kind of a background story on like why I started the podcast, what it's about, and a little bit about me. I think that episode was really short. It was only like maybe like 12 minutes. And then the second individual episode I did, I don't remember what it was about actually. I did do another one. And then I think one of my favorite episodes that I've done, it was my 21st episode, and I am the college graduating class of 2021. And so I did an episode called 21 Things That I Learned in College. And I just really enjoyed that. I think it was because it was like the 21st episode, class of 2021. I just thought it was really clever. It's not actually that cool. But I really enjoyed that episode because I think I talked a lot about lessons that I learned. And as someone who likes being introspective and like sharing those things, I try to mix in some like more like good life lessons that I personally learned, and then some things that were more generic and fun that I learned. So that was definitely one of my favorite episodes in terms of like individual recordings.
Yeah, and God knows the impact that you've had by releasing stuff like that. I think like a lot of people will downplay it, but like if one other individual comes across this and definitely changes their decision making in the future, like I think for the better, of course, I think it's definitely like a lot more significant than most people think about it. I'll say this a million times, like at least for my thought process in terms of like this podcast side we're recording at the moment, I keep on saying it's the most selfish thing I'll ever do. This is something that like I do it for me. I do it for me. I want to learn so much more about other people's life and how they tackle stuff. But if the byproduct is that like somebody else could learn something out of it, like that's the other thing. So for me, it's on the opposite spectrum. Is that like, sure, of course, maybe some people will benefit off this, but number one is Perry. Perry needs to learn all of this. Perry needs to get all of that, and you guys are all welcome. I'm not kidding, but maybe one of the I guess I don't know how to frame this question. It's more like, what's the expectation? Because like I get asked this of like, what's your goal? Like, what's the goal of hosting a podcast? Why are you talking to so many different people? Like, it's endless. You're never gonna end to a final stage. You're never gonna be like complete this whole experience. So if I speak for myself, at least very personal reasons, that like I'll keep on saying this. This is all for me. I want to talk to people. I want to learn everything that they know, and like I know that in some of these conversations that I've had in these episodes have changed how I decide to do stuff. Some decisions I made out of it. So at least that's my take on why are you making this? Sure, people could say like you could make money out of all that, but if I took this podcast as my job, I will be unhappy. If my living depends on this, I will be absolutely like not enjoying it as much as I will. So on a very general I guess overview, that's my expectation of this podcast is just keep on going, meet new people. Don't worry about like if it's actually going to keep food on your plate, because it will not. But maybe from somebody else who is producing or like a podcast like that, what is your expectation from the project?
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, that it is extremely hard to monetize a podcast. Like there are ways to monetize it, but just like to actually make a lot of money off of it, you actually have to have like thousands, like tens of thousands of listeners who come back constantly for your podcast, and then you have to be able to get ads for it. And so it costs, it's hard work. It's really hard to get there, and most podcasts probably do not make it there. In terms of expectations, it started out as a place where I just wanted to be able to talk to people, kind of similar to you. Like I wanted to talk to cool people who were in tech, who were minorities or females. Actually, I think all of my guests have been female. And so that was just the group of people that I wanted to talk to. But I talked to people from a wide range. So they weren't all like software engineers. Some of them were hardware engineers. Some of them were product managers. Some of them are data scientists. Some of them are just like nonprofit leaders who work for the tech space. So really, really cool people, and just being able to talk to them was my main goal. But I think something that really motivated and inspired me and helped me keep going at times when it was rough, because I was doing school, recruiting, extracurriculars, and this podcast all at the same time, was I did get a few messages, some from people that I don't know, and then some from like strangers, but people who were telling me things like, oh, this episode really helped me when I was like looking for a product management job, or like the past like 3 episodes that you had were really helpful for me because I've been going through a rough time in terms of figuring out what I want to do with my life. And so I was really surprised by some of the people who reached out to me and told me things like that, because there were people who I knew from, let's say, high school, but I haven't talked to them in like 7 years. And they like, when they did reach out, I was always really touched, and it always like really made my day. And it really surprises you every time you find out like who listens to your podcast, because podcasting is a one-way street in terms of you put stuff out there, but you never know who the other person is doing, or what they hear, or what they think, and they can't really respond to you that easily, because currently there is no platform that easily allows like podcast host listener interaction. There'll probably be one like that someday. There are some platforms out there that are kind of like that nowadays, but none that are like super mainstream. And so yeah, I think it was also a way that I think I could help give back just a little bit to the community. I think there's a growing community of folks who are championing diversity, women in STEM or women in tech. And I think that, just being able to help add just a little bit to the conversation was a really good way, I think, to give back to this community that I've definitely gained from myself.
Oh yeah, I keep on saying every little helps, but even saying little is a very subjective term. I think definitely the right direction, the good intent, that's the important part. And the fortunate part is that it's going to get easier and easier for people to reach out and say how much it has impact. I think over the years, today, it's definitely been a lot easier than back then. Than receiving snail mail and be like, thank you for doing this. It's like good old fan mail days. But I'm telling you, I think everything that you've done so far, if people haven't checked it out, Tech Gal is something you should put on your map. But Before I wrap up everything, tips. This is something that you've definitely given a lot so far with the whole podcast, but on a very general, I guess, like closing thoughts more than anything is tips for people that are going to a similar path, whether it's the path of product management, whether it's the path of starting always your own little project, whether it's a podcast or whatever. This is probably like a two-part question. What kind of tips do you have for the people in those positions currently, whether they're in school, whether they're very green in terms of like deciding on what they want to do? Because I feel like there is some contentment on who you are today and what you're doing. So for the people that are listening in terms of, hey, it's admirable, I want to be in that position, what kind of advice would you have for them?
That's a good question. I think that for people who want to go into product management, doing your research on what it's really about, trying to figure out what the day-to-day actually looks like before you assume that just because there's the word manager in it and you can have that position as an entry-level person, will be really helpful, because I think there are a lot of assumptions. Or nowadays, it's just like a really hot topic, but people might not know what they're getting themselves into. And so it's really important, I think, to either talk to people who are currently PMs, listen to podcasts like this one. For people who are in that position can be really helpful, so that you know what you're getting yourself into, and it's not just because it's like the cool thing on the block right now, because there'll probably be a new cool thing on the block in like 5 years. And so if you're just doing it for the reputation or because it seems hot, like that's probably not the right reason to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good take on. You definitely don't want to set your bar super high in being a product manager. Like, there are dark days. It's not like just rosy and like everything.
Yeah,
there are dark days on that. So I'm glad you pointed that out. And for the people who are trying to figure out, like, what's this will to do stuff out there, like starting a podcast. So like, even as you're saying, there's a lot of tips of starting a podcast, but like, just, knowing that there's so much knowledge out there, like, where did this like conviction that you could learn so much from talking to people, like, for the people that don't know where to start, looking, what is a good advice to be like, look, the world is so big, you get to do so many things. What spoke to you when you decided to start a podcast?
Yeah. Well, if it's just for podcasting in general, I think I just personally listen to a lot of podcasts, so I was kind of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to make my own? And at first it was kind of a joke, and then it became like, oh, let's like actually do this. And so that's kind of where it came from. Just like a personal interest in podcasts myself. But I think a part of your question that was slightly like unrelated to podcasts, the general idea was like, why would you do things outside of work or school? And like why, like, what is the motivation to do that? I've actually been thinking about this a lot. And I think that one thing that's really important to consider is like, what is it that you value and what is it that you want to like do with your time? And so, for example, if you're someone who really values, let's say, community, maybe service, giving back to the community, doing something that helps you fulfill that value can be really fulfilling. And I think it's really important to not put all of your eggs in one basket in terms of just maybe putting all your focus on work or school, because not everything is going to go your way in that one particular category. So if you put all of your hopes and your effort into that, when that thing is not going well, everything just feels really terrible. But if you are, let's say, doing work and you're still trying really hard, but let's say you have like one or two hobbies that you're pursuing at the same time, if work's not going super well or school's not going well, you at least have something else that you can look forward to that can still make you feel fulfilled or make you happy. So I think that is something to consider in terms of like, what's the importance of pursuing hobbies or pursuing something else or doing something else outside of work.
Of course. I think one of the words is probably outlet to being able to do other things that you like. But when you consider the impact that you've had over the past couple of years on many individual level, but also on a just higher scale, I think it's absolutely valuable what you've done so far. Yeah, where can people follow you? I know you have so much content out there, but yeah, let us know. I'm obviously going to link it, but yeah, what we want to share with the people in terms of if they want to follow you, check out your latest things.
Yeah, so if you want to check out my podcast, it's called Tech Gals. It's on all major podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. It's out there. You can follow the podcast at tech.gals on Instagram. In terms of my personal stuff, you can follow me on Instagram at themaddy.co. That's Maddy, Maddy. And I actually started uploading YouTube videos, primarily travel videos. So if you want to follow me or watch my videos there, I'm Maddy Chen.
And that's just the beginning. Just want to say thank you so much again for being on the show. This insight I keep on saying is something that I don't always get to relate from your point of view. So big thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
And of course, I will catch you guys on the next one. Well, that was fun, wasn't it? All of Maddy's links are shared at perrytiu.com/podcast, episode number 33. Big thanks to Maddy again for being on the show, and to you guys for listening. Make sure to follow Podcasts Written by a Software Engineer on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Instagram, Twitter, and go check out the merch at perrytiu.com/shop. Big love. I'll catch you guys on the next one.